Welcome to the Backyard Professor Responds videos. I have a video of a gentleman who is playing about several remarks of Elder David A. Bednar of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, wherein he discusses the idea of Zion and the New Jerusalem. So let's get this show started. We will do a response video in detail showing how the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints today is changing the narrative from Joseph Smith's day in order to hide some very important information on our bearing of Joseph Smith. I have just finished reading Dan Vogel's incredible book, Charisma Under Pressure. 820 some odd pages. I took about 9 days, and I am already in the process of reading it again. It is a most impressive book, and it's going to have direct bearing on tonight's response on what Elder David Bednar talks about, the idea of Zion and the New Jerusalem. I am not going to cover this entire video. I just want to show you how the church today has shifted from the ideological vision and understanding of the prophet Joseph Smith. So let's get started with their first video clip, and we will see what they've got to say and how they've got to say it.
Indications that the restoration is ongoing in the early history of the church. The call to the Latter-day Saints all over the world was to come to Zion, come to Kirtland, come to Nauvoo, come to Salt Lake. And Joseph taught that the purpose of the gathering was so that saints would be in a position, in a place where temples could be built. They needed the people, they needed the resources, they needed the skills to be able to do that. So that was the purpose of the entire church gathering. It has to do with temples.
And this ignores what Joseph Smith actually described the purpose of the gathering is, which should be no surprise at all, but they are simply wrong. Dead wrong. Let's take a look at the second video clip I have to share with you to see where else they are flubbing up.
And being able to build temples, being able to have people receive the blessings and the covenants of the temple. All right, but continuing on, he says, but that began to change in the administration of President Kimball, when he and other church leaders said, no, stay where you are. Don't come to Salt Lake. This is not the only place where you find Zion. Okay, now why am I bringing this up? Because there's this really big misconception. Well, I don't know how big it is really, but there's a certain faction of people that the way that they foresee the second coming in the millennium is that the entire church, all that are righteous, the entire church is going to be living in Missouri, in the Jackson County area, in New Jerusalem. And from what I've gathered, it's based on their understanding when they read Doctrine and Covenants. They see it as like a frozen in time type of thing, that no, that is set in stone. The entire church is supposed to be in Jackson County, Missouri, and that's how things are going to be in the last.
He says that's how things are going to be in the last days. Now, this is not a misconception of the church. This is a prophecy of the prophet Joseph Smith, which the church is very happy to ignore because it ends up being an unfulfilled prophecy, which means it's a false prophecy. It is a prophecy that in order to save Joseph Smith, they have to redefine his prophecy. This is what we're seeing in these video clips right now, and it makes the prophecy farcical. The church doesn't want us to know how Joseph Smith has been proven a false prophet through false prophesyings. Therefore, they are redefining what is going on. Let's take a look at this third clip, and we shall see where they take this further.
Days. Okay. Whereas what Elder Bednar and others have said is that in the beginning, at the time when the Doctrine and Covenants were written, that was the directive for that time. Okay. In the future was uncertain. They were just going with what the Lord was saying. Okay, now's the time for everyone to gather to New Jerusalem. We're going to build New Jerusalem. But guess what? That didn't happen. The saints weren't ready. And so they moved on.
Yes, notice the psychology here. The saints weren't ready. And so you always blame everyone except the real culprit, and that is Joseph Smith making stuff up. And he makes stuff up actually on the fly a lot and puts it in the voice of Jesus Christ as a revelation. Remember, one of Joseph Smith's definitions of revelation is when you feel the pure flow of intelligence, then you are being inspired by the Holy Ghost. And so any idea you have can be considered a revelation from Jesus Christ. And this is precisely why it is only Joseph Smith who is able to give us an entire full book we call the Doctrine and Covenants of all kinds of revelations in all kinds of situations to all manner of people in all manner of places, because no one since him actually does have that kind of chutzpah to think that everything they think is from the Holy Ghost, and therefore Jesus Christ is saying that to them, like Joseph Smith taught. What they are doing here is redefining his words, and it's very ineffective when we look at the actual historical record, which I will begin doing after this last video clip I have to share with you on how these people are truly misunderstanding on purpose, because it's a very clever misdirection in order to get our eye off the fact that Joseph Smith and his prophecies and his revelations have not been fulfilled. Let's take one final look at this.
So again, he said, okay, in the early history of the church, the call to the Latter-day Saints all over the world was to, this is not, the transcription is not right here. The call to the Latter-day Saints all over the world was to come to Zion, come to Kirtland, come to Nauvoo, come to Salt Lake. And Joseph taught that the purpose of the gathering was so that the saints would be in a position, in a place where temples could be built. They needed the people, they needed the resources, they needed the skills to be able to do.
And here is where the misleading is at its strongest. Elder Bednar is correct that yes, they needed people. Joseph Smith needed people. He couldn't build this temple by himself, but it was not to gather the people in order to build temples. This is where they've lost Joseph Smith's vision, and I will demonstrate this historically to you tonight through a few sources. It was to be a safe place so that when Jesus comes back and destroys the wicked, the saints will not be destroyed. Zion was designed as a place of refuge, not for building temples only all over the world, like today's church is misleading people. They lost the New Jerusalem. That was Jackson County, Missouri. They got thrown out. And they tried to get it back, Zion's Camp March, and they utterly failed to do so. Then they went elsewhere, not to build temples. But the historical record and Joseph Smith's revelations have been recorded. We have those. We know what he was thinking. He gathered them to another place so that they could build a temple, so that they could receive power from on high, and then go back to Jackson County, Missouri, and take it back over. The purpose was not to build temples. The purpose was to get power to go redeem Jackson County, Missouri, Zion, the New Jerusalem, so that Jesus had some place to come back to a people prepared who survived the apocalypse. Jesus Christ was coming very soon in Joseph Smith's ideological vision, and all of his followers believed that, and they said so. So what this is, this theme of an ongoing restoration, is a new strategy in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in our day. And what this does is it takes our eyes off of the fact that the New Jerusalem is a failure. It never happened. Why? Because Jesus never came back again. And they don't want us to recognize that Joseph's prophecies in these regards, with the return of Jesus Christ, within that generation and the brethren defined generation to be those living within the sound of their voice then. They meant within 100 years, in their lifetimes, if not their lifetimes, their children's lifetimes. And they had to go back to Jackson County, Missouri, the New Jerusalem, in order to build the temple as the gathering spot. And all of the people who were going to be saved were supposed to gather at that one location, because Jesus was going to destroy the rest of the entire wicked world. That is Joseph Smith's vision, which today's church clouds over. They've redefined the vision, and they've lost it. Now let's take a look at some historical sources. Richard Bushman, Rough Stone Rolling. Joseph Smith, Rough Stone Rolling. On page 122, under the heading of the gathering, they gave a mission to the Lamanites to go to the borders of the Lamanites and begin converting the Lamanites, because the Book of Mormon said that was going to happen before Jesus came. So they were trying to fulfill Book of Mormon prophecy, which also has failed. Not only have they not been able to convert the Lamanites still don't believe in Jesus Christ. As per the modern church's definition of who the Lamanites are, all of the Native American peoples in North and South and Central America, this has been a dismal failure. The Indian placement program in Spencer W. Kimball's day has failed. The Lamanite has not been converted, and Jesus Christ has not come back. In a covenant signed on October 17th, Oliver Cowdery promised, in addition to teaching the Indians, to rear up a pillar as a witness where the temple of God shall be built. In the glorious New Jerusalem, Cowdery was to locate a site for the holy city prophesied in both St. John's Revelation and the Book of Mormon. The New Jerusalem, the Revelation said, was to be situated on the border of the Lamanites, which they all knew was the western edge of Missouri, to which the federal government was forcibly removing the eastern states' Indians. The foursome were to convert Indians, if possible, and to locate the place of the New Jerusalem along the frontier. And those four were Peter Whitmer Jr., and Parley Pratt, and Zeba Peterson, and Oliver Cowdery. They were the missionaries to the Lamanites to find the place to build the New Jerusalem. The references to the New Jerusalem assume more importance because of another revelation by Jesus Christ given to Joseph Smith that just before the September conference, the revelation described in gruesome details the calamities to come upon the earth before Christ's second coming, a plague of flies, maggots, signs in the heavens, destructive hailstorms, devouring fire. In the meantime, the revelation did say the church was to find the righteous and bring them to safety. There's the key that today's church doesn't grasp. And ye are called to bring to pass the gathering of mine elect. For mine elect hear my voice, and harden not their hearts. Wherefore the decree hath gone forth from the Father, that they shall be gathered in unto one place upon the face of this land, meaning the North American continent, and to prepare their hearts and be prepared in all things against the day when tribulation and desolation are sent forth upon the wicked. So the New Jerusalem was to be a refuge against the coming calamities. The conversion of the Indians, the building of the New Jerusalem, and the gathering of the elect came together in a single plan to prepare the world for the Savior's second coming. And none of this happened. Richard Bushman. The none of this happened is my comment. Richard Bushman did not say that, though he could have and been entirely safe. Another source that I highly recommend, Sidney Rigdon, a portrait of religious excess by Richard S. Van Wagner, an absolutely magnificent text. Page 142. Mormonism in its purest distillation is the fused product of Joseph Smith's and Sidney Rigdon's revolutionary thinking condensed into the prophet's revelations. Their joint vision recast existing American social, economic, and political systems into an apocalyptic model that they called Zion. What was more or less unique about the Mormon religious commonwealth was the application of biblical prophecies and events to the American scene. Jackson County, Missouri, at the heart of the continent. This was the site of the fabled city of the New Jerusalem. And that sacred ground declared the prophet, not Mesopotamia or the Great Rift Valley of Africa, had been Old Eden, the cradle of humanity, had been in Missouri, Adam-on-Diamond. So a place of refuge and inheritance. It was a sanctuary. What for other millennial faiths was the imminent end, for the Mormons was a new beginning, fired by a biblical imagination which fused history and myth together, Old Testament and New Testament, into one consuming vision, wrote one late observer. Mormonism reflected high-wrought millenarian excitement. The prophet would reenact an old drama, rehearsed in every gospel dispensation when the righteous sought to separate themselves from the wicked in special gatherings. Enoch's holy city, Noah's seaworthy ark, Abraham's intrepid family, the great migration of the tribes under Moses, the flights of Book of Mormon peoples under Lehi, Mulek, and the brother of Jared, the establishment of the primitive church, momentous gatherings followed all too often by heartbreaking captivities and dispersions or dissolutions. But now, in the fullness of times, after the long night of Christian apostasy, Israel by blood and by adoption was being called home. Rachel would weep no more for her children. Ezekiel's dry bones were being quickened. The clay of Jeremiah's potter reworked. Isaiah's remnant ransomed. It was Daniel's stone ready to roll forth and St. John's heavenly city about to come to earth. Missouri mobs annulled desultory Mormon plans to build utopia in Jackson County and evoke the second advent of Jesus Christ. That was the main reason for the gathering. Furthermore, during a conference at Norton 2 days later, Smith prophesied that the time is near when desolation is to cover the earth. Without the redemption of Zion, we must fall. Joseph Smith's entire life was all about getting the New Jerusalem built. When they got kicked out, his entire reason for regathering the saints and build a temple was to give them the power from on high through an endowment so that they could go back and take Missouri back. The idea was never to build temples all over the flippin' place. There was only one city, Zion, New Jerusalem, and that was in Jackson County, Missouri. This is what the church has changed in the narrative. Sylvester Smith, a disgruntled camp member of the Zion's camp, got very angry at Joseph Smith for prophesying lies in the name of the Lord. And he told the truth because his prophecies to Zion camp just did not become fulfilled at all. The ill-fated predictions about the end of the world or the redemption of Zion, those misfired, is how he put it. Further, here's Joseph Smith himself saying the emigration to this land is very extensive and numerous. The first presidency are chiefly engaged in counseling and settling the immigrants to this land. The prophecies are fulfilling very fast upon our heads and in our day and our generation. He was being very optimistic about the gathering. They are gathering from the north and from the south and from the east and from the west unto Zion for safety against the day of wrath, which is to be poured out without measure upon this generation, according to the prophets. With the passing of time, the Missouri era was 1831 to 1839. And this cast a deep shadow over the history of Mormonism. Joseph Smith taught that the area was the land of antediluvian Old Testament narration, that Jackson County was Old Eden, that Adam-on-Diamond in nearby Davies County was the place where Adam and Eve fled when driven from the idyllic garden, and that far west in Caldwell County was the spot where Cain killed Abel. Mormons hoped initially and perhaps naively that Jackson County, the fabled land of their inheritance, would be rescued from non-believing hordes. Joseph Smith advised Lyman White and others of the Missouri High Council on 16th of August, 1834, to be in readiness to move into Jackson County in 2 years from the 11th of September next, which is the appointed time for the redemption of Zion. With the passing of time, it became clear that Zion would not be redeemed, nor would the saints be redressed for their Jackson County losses, but that was where Joseph Smith was focused on. This is really important to know this. And I think that's the part of that I wanted to read to you. Finally, I will get to Dan Vogel's book, Charisma Under Pressure. Throughout this text, Vogel has given us much to ponder. This is on page VII, the very first page of his book in the introduction. His early followers called him Joseph the Seer. It must have been comforting for them to be in the presence of someone in direct contact with God. One needed no longer guess as to what God wanted his children to believe or to do. The veil had been parted. The only thing that remained was to be obedient and mindful of the prophet's guidance, for one's salvation depended upon it, both spiritually and physically. Joseph Smith announced that the end of the world was near, that Christ's second coming was imminent, and that he'd been called by God to establish a new Jerusalem near the western border of the United States, where believers would gather to escape the wars and the plagues about to sweep the wicked from the earth and live God's law in perfect harmony and peace. The Book of Mormon and several revelations had proclaimed it, but success depended on Smith's ability to win and maintain influence over his people. This apparently is what David Bednar does not want us to understand. They have changed the meaning. On March 17, 1831, I'm on page 34 of Vogel's book. On March 7, 1831, Smith dictated a long revelation to the people of my church and ye elders about the great and urgent work they were called to perform in preparation for the end of the world. It was imminent, and it was real close. This is Joseph Smith's vision. The revelation reviewed various Bible prophecies about the end times, including Matthew 24, of course. He added in an elliptical comment that the Gentiles were being fulfilled, the times of the Gentiles were being fulfilled before the second coming, and he took the parallel version of Jesus' sermon in Luke 21:24. Then he added an elliptical comment that my disciples shall stand in holy places and shall not be moved, while the wicked are destroyed by an overflowing scourge and continual wars. The purpose of reviewing these prophecies was to motivate Smith's followers about their mission. And what was that mission? To establish the New Jerusalem as a means of escaping the great tribulation of the last days. All the historical records say this. Elder Bednar is being very clever in keeping our eye away from this point. The main purpose of the trip to Missouri was to locate the spot where the city of Zion and its temple would be built. In 1835, Smith said he received by a heavenly vision a commandment in June following to take my journey to the western boundaries of the state of Missouri and there to designate the very spot which was to be the central spot for the beginning of the gathering. On page 81 now, Smith dictated a revelation designating Independence as the site for the city of Zion and the location for the construction of a temple. In this revelation, the Lord declared, Missouri is the land which I have appointed and consecrated for the gathering of the saints. Missouri is the land that I have appointed and consecrated for the gathering of the saints. Jesus Christ specifically says that state alone. You'll notice how different that is than what we heard in those video clips, right? Wherefore, this is the land of promise and the place for the city of Zion. Behold, the place which is now called Independence is a central place, and the spot for the temple is lying westward upon a lot which is not far from the courthouse. In another account, Smith said, after viewing the country, seeking diligently at the hand of God, he manifested himself unto me and designated to me and others the very spot upon which he designed to commence the work of the gathering and the upbuilding of an holy city which should be called Zion. Apparently, Smith's inspection was necessary before he could receive a revelation identifying the location of Zion and its temple. Kind of a humorous point Vogel makes. On page 90, on August 3rd, 1831, 8 elders and a few others gathered on a wooded lot, located about half a mile west of the village of Independence to dedicate the ground for the construction of the New Jerusalem temple. Smith may have previously gained access to the property from Jones H. Flournoy, who had obtained squatters' rights to large tracts of lands in the area with the view of selling them. The meeting began by reading Psalm 87, which among other things declares, "The Lord loveth the gates of Zion more than all the dwellings of Jacob." So this is the theme. Page 194, in the Book of Mormon, Jesus had promised that believing Gentiles would assist in gathering and converting the Indians and in building the holy city of the New Jerusalem, and then the powers of heaven shall be in the midst of this people. Yea, even I will be in the midst of you. In the New Jerusalem. Page 195, having recently returned from the mission of warning the major cities in the east of the coming destruction by famine and plague and war, Smith now prepared to launch a major missionary program to do the same thing. Behold, I send you out to testify and to warn the people. The revelation declared to these missionaries, therefore tarry ye and labor diligently, that ye may be perfected in your ministry, to go forth among the Gentiles for the last time. They're stone cold serious. Jesus is coming. This is it. This is your last mission. Then we build Zion. You got one chance at this. See, when you see how the scripture actually reads, you can see how far off the modern church is, because none of this ever happened, and they don't want us to know that. For their souls may escape the wrath of God, the desolation and abomination which awaiteth the wicked, both in this world and in the world to come. So now he's up in the game, right? Page 237. Well, by November 1832, the Mormon community in Jackson County, Missouri had swelled to more than 800. With indifference to the original setters, the saints had re-Christianed Jackson County the Mormon Holy Land, the prophesied land of Zion, and the location of the future New Jerusalem temple. If that was not motivation enough for the gathering, Joseph Smith's revelations had declared that Zion was to be a city of refuge, a place of safety for the saints of the Most High God, and that it shall come to pass among the wicked, that every man that will not take his sword against his neighbor must needs flee unto Zion for safety. In his January 4th, 1833 letter to the editor of the American Revivalist and Rochester Observer, Smith had warned his fellow Americans to flee to Zion before the overflowing scourge overtake you. This was in 1833. His confidence prevented him from foreseeing the turn of events just over the horizon. Instead of a place of refuge, by the year's end, Zion would become a place of danger and a place from which approximately 1,200 Mormons had to flee from. Unaware of the danger and the anger that was brewing in Jackson County, church leaders in Kirtland envisioned a great and glorious future for Zion. Optimistically, the presidency instructed that where this square is laid off and supplied, lay off another in the same way, and so fill up the world in these last days, and let every man live in the city, for this is the city of Zion. Let every man live in the city, for this is the city of Zion. There's Joseph Smith's revelations and prophecies and vision. Not all over the world making loads and loads and loads of temples. They didn't have that kind of time. Jesus was almost here. They had to get Zion done. That's what today's church doesn't want you to know. While Smith and his counselors were particular in declaring that the plot for the city and the size of the forms and the dimensions of the house were given us by the Lord, in less than 2 years, it had become outdated. They had to redo the whole outline again. The first of the 24 temples to be constructed in Zion was to be composed of stone and brick of the best kind and measure 87 feet long and 61 feet wide, and 10 feet taken off on the east end for the stairway leaves the inner court 78 by 61 feet, slightly larger than its Ohio counterpart. They were into explicit details because this was it. This was the only place they were going to build that temple, because this was the only place where everybody who wanted to be safe had to gather. Page 253, Missouri Mormons were confident that God would not reveal his will concerning Zion and its temple without providing a means of accomplishing it, because that's the impression Joseph Smith gave them through revelations from Jesus Christ, who assured them, my plans cannot fail. You go there and I will fight your battles for you. Jesus Christ told Joseph Smith that. Joseph Smith passed it on to the Mormons, and every time the Mormons tried, Jesus never showed up, and they got their butts kicked and thrown out, which caused a lot of apostasy. Do we really have to wonder why? Page 259, Smith again assured the Missouri church leaders that despite the threats of their enemies to destroy Zion, we have had the word of the Lord that we shall be delivered from your danger, and we shall again flourish in spite of hell. This God has communicated to me by the gift of the Holy Ghost, that this should be the case after much prayer and supplication, and also that an other printing office must be built. The Lord knows how, and also it is the will of the Lord that the store should be kept. Smith wished to inspire followers not to lose faith in Zion. With his charismatic reputation in jeopardy, what he did was he doubled down on revelation. And his doubling down was to the effect that promising that Zion would be delivered from its enemies, this too would ultimately prove to be incorrect. Smith strictly forbade the sale of any Jackson County land to any non-Mormons. It is the will of the Lord that not 1 foot of land purchased should be given to the enemies of God or sold to them, but if any is sold, let it be sold to the church. In their July 1834 appeal to the people and constituted authorities of this nation and to the ends of the earth, Missouri church leaders declared that to sell their land in Jackson County would amount to a denial of our faith, as that land is the place where the Zion of God shall stand, according to our faith and belief in the revelations of God. I conclude by telling you that we wait the command of God to do whatever he please, and if ye shall go up to Zion and defend the brethren by the sword, we fly, and we count not our lives dear to us. Page 270. Smith could have said he was commanded by God to establish Zion without specifying a location, but a revelation he dictated on July 20th, 1831, declared that the place which is now called Independence is the center place, and the spot of the temple is lying westward upon a lot which is not far from the courthouse. Tying Zion to a geographic spot by revelation was a miscalculation from which he would never fully recover. His next misstep was to choose a location already occupied by settlers who opposed the Mormon takeover of their community. He underestimated the resolve of the non-Mormon inhabitants of Jackson County to protect their community. Continuing to make plans for the city of Zion, even after learning about the destruction of the press and agreement by church leaders to leave, Joseph Smith kept right on trucking. While the loss of their holy land caused some Mormons to question their faith, most saw it as a test of their devotion. Of course, Joseph Smith talked him into that too. Parley P. Pratt's November 12, 1833 prophecy that we shall be enabled to return to our houses by the 1st of next January and enjoy the fruit of our labor, and none to molest or make afraid. This underscores how incomprehensible the loss of Zion was to believers, not to mention Joseph Smith. Pratt felt anxious to rescue fellow believers who were questioning how the Lord could permit their enemies to eject them from the Holy Land, while at the same time command them to build a city and a central temple. His prophecy reflects his confidence that government officials would correct the injustice that was being inflicted on the Mormons. He was so sure of this that he was willing to stake his prophetic reputation on it. Here's Parley Pratt. If it does not come to pass, we may call him a false prophet. So now we can only wonder what Pratt felt when 1833 passed without returning to Zion, can't we? Yeah. The loss of Zion was a blow to the Mormon psyche and a challenge to Smith's authority. He had not seen it coming. He and Rigdon had laughed 2 years earlier when David Whitmer predicted that publishing the Revelations would result in destruction and expulsion. Maintaining his prophetic status in the midst of this crisis would be difficult. A similar crisis occurred when the ancient Israelites lost their homeland to the Assyrians and the Babylonians. The prophets explained the loss as the result of sin and prophesied about a future period of restoration. And this is exactly the policy that Smith will adopt. What we find is something remarkably interesting. Redeeming Zion was imperative. Cowdery said, since it is of but little consequence to proclaim the everlasting gospel to men and warn them to flee to Zion for refuge when there is no Zion, so Zion must be redeemed, and then the saints can have a place to flee to for safety. The June 1831 conference. To those who may have been questioning Joseph Smith's revelations that located Zion in independence, here's how Smith argued. Take away the Book of Mormon and the Revelations. And where is our religion? We have none. For without a Zion and a place of deliverance, we must fall. For God will gather out his saints from the Gentiles, and then comes desolation or destruction, and none can escape except the pure in heart who are gathered. Smith used fear of the coming destruction to motivate followers to build Zion in the wilderness, both of which rested on Smith's revelations. Rigdon spoke next. The second coming is now just before us. He declared, for if they are not gathered, they must wail because of his coming. Well, Oliver Cowdery and others also spoke on the deliverance of Zion and the need for donations. Joseph prophesied that if Zion was not delivered, the time was near when all of this church, wherever they might be found, would be persecuted and destroyed. Fortunately, that prophecy was also not fulfilled. Page 353, Mormons in Clay County were preparing for the arrival of Zion's camp and the possible outbreak of war. According to Whitmer, the saints were here preparing with all possible speed to arm themselves and others, prepare to go to Jackson County. Always get ready and go back to Jackson County. When the camp arrives, for we have some hints from Joseph the seer that this will be our privilege, so we were in hopes that the long-wished-for day will soon arrive, and Zion be redeemed to the joy and the satisfaction of the poor suffering saints. The hints from Joseph the seer probably refers to the February 24th, 1834 revelation, which declared that the saints must needs be led out of bondage by power, and that they would see the redemption of Zion. Page 483 now. On November 16th, Joseph dictated a letter to the messenger and advocate. The main subject of the letter was the gathering of Israel in the last days. Men and angels are to be co-workers in bringing to pass this great work, and a Zion is to be prepared, even a new Jerusalem, for the elect that are gathered from the four quarters of the earth, and to be established an holy city. For the tabernacle of the Lord shall be with them in that singular city. Page 673, following the failure of Zion's camp, Smith had predicted that the redemption of Zion would occur before September 11th, 1836, always seeking to redeem Jackson County, Missouri, where the New Jerusalem and the city of Zion would be, and none of Joseph Smith's revelations or prophecies ever happened, but that is where he always focused. Although he made strenuous efforts to gather money to buy out non-Mormons in Jackson County, that date too passed without fulfillment. The bank was established in part, the Kirtland Bank. The Kirtland Bank, along with the Kirtland Temple, which was to endow them with power from on high so that they would not fail twice but go redeem Zion in Jackson County, Missouri. The Kirtland Bank was also to raise funds for the redemption of Zion. And that too failed. Naturally, Smith was reluctant to commit to another plan of redeeming Zion, which might jeopardize the building up of Caldwell County. Smith's answers skirted the issue of retaking Zion by force, and instead they speak of Zion as the church or the community of believers, power as the priesthood, and returning as repentance. And finally, one of the most powerful endings of a book I've ever read concerning the history of the church. Page 885, following. Oliver Huntington, the younger brother of Dimmock, remarked once, "When the saints were driven from the state of Missouri, it was a very surprising circumstance that we could not understand." So we naturally asked ourselves the question, well, where can we find another Holy Land? How or when shall we get back to the consecrated spot for the New Jerusalem that is to be built? Apostle Parley Pratt was less patient. Troubled by the loss of Zion and the non-fulfillment of Mormonism's central prophecy, Pratt sought a word of encouragement from Joseph Smith. Writing from his mission field in Manchester, England, December 4th, 1841, notice the date here, after having escaped jail in Missouri, Pratt asked Smith, "When will the purchased possession be redeemed and the temple and city commence in Jackson County, Missouri? When will the ungodly, the lying Gentiles begin to lose their power and cease to rule? And we who have now spent half of our lives for them be privileged to turn from the Gentiles and go in full power to the remnants of Joseph, the Indians, and Israel." Pratt's petition apparently went unanswered. However, Smith had previously answered such questions in sermons by expanding the definition of Zion. So now notice what he's doing. And in this, the church kind of has an interesting idea. Smith is hiding the fact that, doggone it, I have tried and tried and tried. I have prophesied for a decade, and I have failed in all of my prophecies. None of the revelations from Christ has ever happened. Everyone's beginning to doubt me. What do I do? How do I fix this? Here's how he fixed it. He expanded the definition of Zion and de-emphasized Zion as the only place of refuge. So we can begin to see Joseph Smith changing the original meanings of the original revelations from Jesus, who apparently didn't really know what he was talking about after all, because it just didn't work. Over and over and over again, it just didn't work. So here's how Smith salvaged his idea in his mind. So in the summer of 1839, he declared, "The time is soon coming when no man will have any peace but in Zion and her stakes." He also spoke of the signs that should precede the second coming. "These things are at our doors, but I know not how soon these things will take place." In another sermon delivered about July 19th, 1840, Smith read the parable of the 12 olive trees from an 1833 revelation, and then he remarked, "The land of Zion consists of all North and South America, but that any place where the saints gather is Zion, which every righteous man will build up for a place of safety for his children, that the olive trees are 12 stakes which are yet to be built, not the temple in Jackson, as some suppose, for while the 12 olive stakes are being built, we will be at peace, but the nations of the earth will be at war." Again, none of this has happened. Even his expanded definition has failed to bring not only the second coming of Jesus Christ. Apparently, he can't come until people are prepared. He sure showed up good in America in 3rd Nephi, though, and those people sure weren't prepared. Crime, and he destroyed 3/4 to 5/8 to 3/4 of them. And then he visited them. So what is this idea of people have to be prepared first? Really? Jesus is never going to come, in other words. Is that a man-made thinking doctrine, in other words? Have to ponder that, don't we? This was a major shift in his view. Instead of fleeing to Jackson County for safety, Smith instructed the saints to seek refuge in Zion's scattered stakes. And that's what the church is teaching today, but they've shifted it too from being places of safety because Jesus is coming soon to, oh, no, build temples, do lots of temple work. They've shifted it. The redemption of Zion is the redemption of all North and South America, Joseph Smith explained, and those 12 stakes must be built up before the redemption of Zion can take place. Well, who doesn't know there's way more than 12 stakes, right? I mean, none of this imagery even matches anything. What had seemed imminent in the 1830s, because Jesus Christ told him so, and Jesus Christ said he had the power to stretch forth his arm and smite Joseph Smith's enemies, but he never did. Smith now moved to an unspecified and more distant future. It's the only thing you can do. Zion and Jerusalem must both be built up before the coming of Christ. How long it will take to do this, 10 years, more, 40 years, who knows? We don't have a clue. And then he declared, "But I prophesy," here we go again, "that the time shall be when these saints shall ride proudly over the mountains of Missouri, and no Gentile dog or Missouri dog shall dare lift a tongue against them, but will lick up the dust from beneath their feet." So far, nothing. And I pray the Father that many here may realize this and see it with their eyes. Never happened. Absolutely everyone alive in his day is dead now. They didn't see it. And it should be stretching his hands toward the place, and in a melancholy tone that made all their hearts tremble, "It should be the will of God that I might live to behold that temple completed and finished from the foundation to the top stone. I will say, O Lord, it is enough. Lord, let thy servant depart in peace, which is my earnest prayer in the name of the Lord Jesus. Amen." And even his prayers were always totally unfulfilled. On January 19th, 1841, Smith dictated a revelation that rescinded the commandment to build up a city and a house unto my name in Jackson County, Missouri. D&C 124, 49 and 51. By the time he received Pratt's questions, he was apparently receiving criticism for this revelation, responding publicly on December 19th, 1841. A man would command his son to dig potatoes, saddle his horse, but before he had done either, tell him to do something else. This is all considered right, but as soon as the Lord gives a commandment and revokes that decree and commands something else, then the prophet is considered fallen. When none of your prophecies are fulfilled, when Jesus promises he will be there leading, guiding, and fighting your enemies, and he doesn't bother to show up, and your enemies are always overpowering you, we can't help but think, is this Joseph Smith just making it up on the fly? Because if you think the other way, you come to a rather blasphemous conclusion. Gee, maybe Jesus isn't strong enough to defeat his enemies, because he never has yet since Joseph Smith was born. The Gentiles have always won, and the Mormons still don't have their Zion, and Jesus still hasn't come. The things that make you go, yeah. Well, many of his followers continued to believe in the September 1832 prophecy that the temple shall be reared in this generation, meaning their lifetime. Don't be throwing the apologetic claptrap at me that the Hebrew or the Greek word for generation can mean 1,000 years and all that. These people described their understanding of the revelation of their generation, meaning them. They will be alive to see this. And that this generation shall not pass away until an house shall be built unto the Lord in Jackson County, Missouri, D&C 84-4. Well, Smith's Zion would be delayed, but not indefinitely. Mormon millennial expectations were reignited in the period of national calamity surrounding the Civil War. All right, now here we go. Mormon leader George Q. Cannon declared in 1864 that the day is near when a temple shall be reared in the central stake of Zion, and the Lord has said his glory shall rest on that house in this generation in which the revelation was given, which is upwards of 30 years ago. Apostle Orson Pratt said in 1870 that Mormons in Utah still had confidence in returning to Jackson County and the building of a great central city. There are many of the old stock still living whose faith in returning to Jackson County is as firm and fixed as the throne of Almighty God. And their faith was worthless. On August 23rd, 1862, Wilford Woodruff recorded in his journal that Brigham Young said to the saints, have to go back to Jackson County, which he expects will be in 7 years. Now, Brigham Young is already the head dog, the male macho, the El Dictator in Utah, and he's even saying, well, just 7 more years and we get to go back. And they've already trekked all the way across the wilderness to get to Utah. But that was not their considered Zion. There was only one Zion to the saints who believed in Joseph Smith's original version even before Joseph Smith changed it because he lost faith in his revelations and prophecies. Historian John G. Gager has discussed the process by which millennial movements survive failure. And he noted that Smith too responded to the non-fulfillment of prophecy by blaming his followers' lack of faith. That's the key. You're never at fault. Oh, no. Your revelations are true. The prophecies are true. It's always the followers' fault. What a beautiful out for, no wonder he could prophesy so often, 6, 7, 8 times a day about the silliest things. Oh, you're going to trip over a rock here this afternoon. You know, stupid stuff like that, because if they didn't, well, you didn't have faith. What a lucky man this Joseph Smith was to have that kind of an out. Smith employed various strategies to overcome the failure of charisma, like redefining Zion, like we said, doubling down on prophecy. He altered his own revelations, and he shifted the focus on unfulfilled preconditions. For instance, such as establishing 12 stakes and preaching the Mormon gospel in every nation first. Oh, that's why it didn't happen. You see, you can do that till the cows come home and yet keep your prophetic mantle. Gager also noted that Smith predictably guided his followers away from preparing for the end of the world, and he redirected their energies toward missionary work and building the kingdom. Interesting. Another strategy was his repeated promises for greater and greater blessings and authority, most notably the 1831 endowment of high priesthood, the 1836 spiritual endowment in the Kirtland Temple, and his 1842 temple endowment ceremony and reception of special keys in Nauvoo. Now he's building up their own egos and worth and value so that maybe we'll just have the power. Maybe we don't need to worry about building that city and going back. We're going to make it. We've already been through several endowments and we've had several temples. You see how Smith is now shifting things. Well, German sociologist Max Weber would not have been surprised to learn that Smith responded to challenges to his charisma by institutionalizing authority. And how he did this, of course, is he expanded the church hierarchy. And he introduced a more legal concept of authority. He aided by his and Oliver Cowdery's accounts of angelic ordinations, which they retrofitted into the earlier revelations. And people complained. David Whitmer and McClellan, William E. McClellan, they said, we never heard of any ordination to a Melchizedek priesthood by angels, whether Peter, James, and John or John. What is all of this noise? And they were in those councils with him from the time the church was started until in the late 1830s up into Kirtland. But this wasn't there because they put this in later to bolster their own authority and then turn around and give that authority to many people who were losing their faith and implicate them and bring them in and make them feel special too. That's how he maintained his authority and kept their belief in him being a true prophet. Very, very interesting. By sharing and expanding authority, Smith fostered group cohesion and created incentives for continuing participation despite being persecuted and charismatic failings of Joseph Smith. The elaborate structure also helped to insulate Smith, especially as his weaknesses and indiscretions became public. And the later on in life we get, in Nauvoo, Joseph Smith became positively heinous. But now that he's beginning to share all this priesthood authority, people are going to actually end up lying about what he is saying and doing to protect him because it protects them. Truth no longer is the factor. Obedience becomes the watchword. Very fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. The institutionalization of charisma, the charismatic qualities and the power of the office are emancipated from the personal qualities of the leader. Indeed, Smith was no longer a prophet leader relying on his revelatory powers to outmaneuver challengers, but he had become president of the church with the authority of his office to lead, and now could only be removed through a difficult and legalistic process. In other words, Smith made it based on the laws of how priesthood offices work, which priesthood officer is above others, etc. Joseph Smith himself being in the absolute top chair, he made it literally impossible for even the entire group of the 12 apostles to remove him. He was God for all intents and purposes. Literally. So this is fascinating. The road to and from Zion was littered with the bodies of those who tried to divert Smith from his quest from both temporal and ecclesiastical power. Smith never admitted the mistakes he made in Ohio and Missouri or accepted blame for what happened at Crooked River. It was always the fault of others. Dissenters, anti-Mormons, whoever, but never him. He never accepted responsibility for the pain, the suffering, the sickness, the death, the starvation, the pure, unadulterated misery that he put his followers through. He never accepted that responsibility. He was the Lord's anointed. He was above having to be responsible. Fascinating. That was his charisma. And the people gave him that authority because they needed something he had that they lacked. And so it was a massive symbiotic relationship. It was absolutely fascinating. Smith's narcissism, which is typical of a charismatic leader in many, many regards, well, this was present from the beginning. But the trauma of near execution and extended incarceration that Smith had to endure, it may have triggered the need to feel invulnerable. So seeking power, protection, and control is exactly what Joseph Smith did in Nauvoo to an astonishing extent. And this, of course, led to his warlike attitude, which led to his death. He lost the will of the people through that. It's fascinating how this actually works. In Nauvoo, Smith expanded his concept of the Godhead now to include a council of the gods and implied that he was among them. When he published the second installment of his Book of Abraham in March 1842. It contained newly translated material about the pre-existence of humans as spirit intelligences and creation by a council of the gods. Hebrew prophet Abraham was told that he was one of the great spirits over which the sun presided and that he had participated in the creation and therefore was chosen before birth, and by implication, so was Joseph. He believed it, but he dared not speak it. An oft-told story handed down among his followers in early Utah was that Smith had once said, "Would to God, brethren, I could tell you who I am. Would to God I could tell you what I know. But you would call it blasphemy, and there are men who upon this stand who would want to take my life." He left his followers a puzzle to argue about his true identity. The protective bubble that Smith created through a network of secret marriages and rituals and a coercive and corrupt hold on the machinery of government, on administration of justice, on law enforcement in Nauvoo could not save him. It was bound to burst sooner or later, and when it did, it was violent and it was final. And it seemed that way to his enemies. They could not have anticipated what would happen next, for they had assumed Mormonism could not survive the death of its founder, and in this they were never more wrong. Mormonism's still alive and well, but it's not Joseph Smith's Mormonism. It does not have his vision and ideology. It has now completely morphed, evolved, and transformed into something that adjusts better to our modern scientific technological society than Smith could have ever envisioned, and still nothing of his ideological vision, nothing of his prophecies, nothing of his revelations, and nothing of his God has been fulfilled. And that's why I found this particular video that I am responding to to be completely unconvincing because Joseph Smith failed.